Welcome to Baseball Professor's 7-day tutorial series, 7 Steps to Building a Fantasy Baseball Champion. I'm Brian Curley, one of the founders here at Baseball Professor, and I'll be narrating for you throughout the week. Today we're going to start with Day 1, Know Your League. But before we jump into today's lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about what this series actually is. It's 7 tutorials sent by email over the next week. Each one is going to build upon the last, so we'll start with things like league basics, which we're doing today, identifying over and underachieving players, drafting, managing your team during the season, and we'll round it all out at the end of the week with how to approach keeper and dynasty formats. Like we said though, today is all about league basics and knowing your league. Before you even think about what players you want to draft, you're going to want to consider the league that you're in and how that affects the way you run your team. We'll start with size of the league. There's shallow leagues and there's deep leagues. Shallow can be anything from 8 to 10 teams. Deeper can be 16, 20, and there's even leagues that are more than that. That affects how you run your team entirely, how to approach the draft and position scarcity. Shortstop is perennially a very shallow position, so if you're in a deep league, you really might want to consider drafting an elite shortstop early on. Free agency is affected because in deeper leagues there's a very small player pool to draw from. You have to be a little bit more careful when you're drafting because you need stable backups in case players go down with injuries or players don't pan out as you expect. In shallow leagues, the free agent pool is generally pretty good, and you can find good replacements for players that get injured, and this allows you to take more risks in your draft. Playoffs, obviously, if you're in a deeper league in a head-to-head format and only 6 teams are making the playoffs out of 16 as opposed to 6 teams making the playoffs out of 10, you have to be a little bit more cognizant throughout the season of making sure your team is performing up to its highest potential. This means if there's slumping players on your team, you might have to dump them a little bit earlier because you can't dig yourself a big hole. There's also the 2 main types of leagues. There's rotisserie and head-to-head. Rotisserie is where you gain stats for each category, and head-to-head is when you actually battle against different opponents each week. There's different ways to approach both of these leagues. Roto Leagues require more of a long-haul marathon type approach, and head-to-head leagues are more like a bunch of mini sprints with each week being a whole separate matchup where the slate is wiped clean. We'll focus on Roto Leagues for a second. End-of-season standings are generated by how well your team did in each category. So if you finish second in home runs in a 10-team league, you're going to get 9 points. And if you finish 7th in saves in a 12-team league, you're going to get 6 points. Trading is vastly different in the two because in head-to-head leagues, you have to consider more where your team is at any given point in the season. As long as you get to the playoffs in September, everything is wiped clean there. So even if you had a monumental lead in home runs throughout the season, that doesn't matter in a head-to-head league because everybody starts the week the same. This brings up the topic of one category performers, where players like Juan Pierre have added value because they do one thing extremely well, which makes them very valuable for people who need to make a push in one category. Head-to-head leagues, like we said, each week is a clean slate, so how you approach your matchup on Monday or Tuesday might be different than how you approach it on Saturday or Sunday. So if you have on Monday or Tuesday when everything is zeros, you want to start your best players, put your best foot forward, and see when the week's wrapping up on Saturday and Sunday where your team stands. If you have a large lead in runs, then you can afford to bench guys who get you high run totals and maybe start some of the guys who get you more home runs and try to make a push to take those categories. And split stats and playing matchups become more important in these leagues because as you get to the end of the week, if you really want to if you need 7 strikeouts from your pitcher and you see that John Lannon is facing the Marlins, who typically do not do very well against left-handed pitchers, then Lannon might actually have some value. He usually only gets 3 to 4 strikeouts maybe, but against the Marlins he might potentially get 6 or 7, and if there's not a lot of pitchers available on free agency, that might be an avenue you want to consider. And just like I said, playoffs are a brand new season, so it doesn't matter how great you are, you're usually going to see the teams that are hot entering the playoffs be the ones that are successful. There's also different types of roster settings once you get past what kind of league you're in. 2-catcher leagues are becoming increasingly popular, and in these leagues, drafting a catcher early on becomes more of a necessity. You don't want to be stuck with both AJ Pierzynski and Miguel Olivo as your 2 starting catchers, so getting one of the top 5 guys it becomes even more important. 3 outfielder and 5 outfielder leagues. Baseball Professor actually employs a 4 outfielder league, but 3 outfielder used to be the standard, and 5 is becoming that now, just because there's a lot more depth and people are getting tired of seeing quality outfielders not being started every day. This really tests your ability as a manager to build a well-rounded roster. This also increases the value of guys with multiple eligibilities. I'm a big fan of Ben Zobrist myself, and he used to be the second baseman for the Tampa Bay Rays, but now he starts mainly outfield. His second base outfield eligibility is pretty valuable. Corner and middle infield slots, these ones they tend to decimate free agency, just because if you just have to start 2 middle infielders, then making sure you get a quality second baseman or shortstop and then having to start another one becomes increasingly important, and you're not going to see a lot of really good players on free agency under these types of leagues. Multiple utility positions are an increasingly popular format as well. This makes owning DH-only players like David Ortiz and Jim Thome a little bit easier. Typically, if you're in a league with one utility spot, these players become a drain on your roster because you want to start them every day, but you can only start them at utility, and therefore they decrease your overall roster flexibility. There's almost an infinite amount of different categories you can use. 5x5 is the typical, most popular one these days. 4x4 used to be what we used, and there's also any other combination. The other categories that are becoming more popular include on-base percentage, slugging, on-base plus slugging, caught stealing, holds, losses, blown saves, and Ks per nine. Each one changes the way players are valued. So if you're in an on-base percentage league, players that walk a lot, even though their batting averages might not be very good, tend to gain a little bit more value. In leagues that value slugging percentage, obviously players with higher slugging percentages gain value. On-base plus slugging is the same. Caught stealing rewards players who have good good stolen base success rates and hurts the ones that just get a lot of steals based on getting a lot of attempts. Holds is an interesting stat because it gives value to middle relievers, which they typically don't have. Matt Thornton had a little bit of value in standard leagues the last couple of years just because he did pick up the occasional save for Bobby Jenks, and his peripherals, or in his ERA and WHIP, they were so good. But in Holds leagues, Matt Thornton gained a lot of value. Same thing goes for losses, which hurts pitchers that perform on bad teams. They tend to get a lot more losses just by virtue of the offense not being able to support them, even though their pitching performances are very good. Blown saves is another interesting one on the same level as holds. It changes the way you get a value of relievers, although typically just closers there. And Ks per nine is probably my favorite stat that we don't use at Baseball Professor. It's still a pretty popular stat, and it gives a lot of value to players who obviously have high strikeout rates. There's other league settings that you need to be cognizant of. Every league is different, and each site, ESPN, Yahoo, CBS, or if there's any other sites that you use, they all have different default settings and league options, and you should be able to view what the default settings are for your league based on some league settings page. Position eligibility, obviously. How many games played or starts at a position does a player need to gain eligibility? In some leagues, you need just 20 games played or 10 starts. In other leagues, you need just 10 games played or 5 starts. Obviously, this changes the way players are valued because players could have different eligibilities in different leagues. Minimum and maximum caps are also very important. Minimum caps tend to be in head-to-head leagues, and maximum caps tend to be in Roto Leagues. This is because in a head-to-head league, where each week is a new slate, you want to make sure that the other team is starting enough players to qualify in the important categories like batting average, ERA, and WHIP. On Yahoo, for example, the minimum cap is 18 as a default. Baseball Professor likes to use 40 in their league. That's just our preference. Maximum caps usually are in Roto Leagues, and they prevent managers from starting an obscene amount of players and accruing ridiculous totals by season's end. If you could start a player every single day at every position, you'd have 180-something player or games started at each position, but generally 162 games is used to cap for each position. Managers have to do their best to set a good pace to approach the limits without actually exceeding them. Trade processing is another important one. There's a couple different ways to approach it. Commissioner veto and league veto are the two main ones. Obviously, they are what they seem like they are. Commissioner veto is where the commissioner has the absolute power and authority to veto any trade, and league veto is usually done by a majority vote. Trade processing, in terms of is the trade processed instantly or is there a period for review, is also important. In some leagues, once a trade is accepted, it goes right through and there's no opportunity for veto. And in others, there's a period of time, maybe a day, 2 days, or 3 days, where the commissioner can veto it or the league can veto it. Knowing how your league does this is important when it comes to processing trades. If you want to get a trade done right away and you want to have the player on your roster in 2 days, then you're going to have to get that trade done a lot more quickly in a league that has some type of review period. How long until proposed trade offers expire is also important. If you leave a trade up there and you propose it to somebody and he doesn't accept it for a week, does the trade automatically disappear and become void? These are things that you're going to want to know. So like we talked about today, there's two main types of leagues, Roto and head-to-head. What are your league starting positions? What categories does your league use? And are there any other rules governing free agency, trading, or roster management? You really need to know these things before you even start talking about drafting or player evaluation. And lucky for you, we're going to start doing that stuff tomorrow.